My experience immigrating to the US started in about 1991. I used to go to the US every year as part of SIGGRAPH, which is a computer graphics conference. And one year while over there was offered a job at Pacific Data Images, who later became part of DreamWorks, who are sort of after a weird circle became the company that did the work on Shrek. But they recruited me over there on what was initially an O1 visa, extraordinary abilities. And you just get letters of recommendation, all that. After a few years there, went through the process of applying for a green card. Got the green card for 5 years, had the probationary period, and then after 5 years applied for citizenship. So the whole process for me was probably, it was about 7 or 8 years, I think, to actually get to now being a dual citizen. We moved to Papua New Guinea. My father was looking for a new job. My parents had 4 kids. They were struggling financially. My dad was in computers, but as I say, it was the early days. There wasn't that much money in computers back then. And he saw this job advertised that pretty much listed all his skills as he was going through the paper and read it out and said, oh, look at this. And he read it to my mother and she said, oh, where is it? And he said, oh, Papua New Guinea. And they had a good laugh. And then my brother, who was a little older than me, he was about 13 at the time, had just started high school and was having a miserable time. And apparently said, well, why can't we go to Papua New Guinea? And my parents went, well, I guess there's not a good reason. So my dad applied for that job and then actually got a better job. Got the senior position to sort of build the computer center there. So we went up initially when I was 11 for a 2-year contract. And we all just loved it. We stayed 7 years. So I left when I was 18. I started in computer animation in sort of the very early days of computer animation. Coming out of high school, I'd intended to train as an architect. I'd been in a car accident in Papua New Guinea where I lived and missed university enrollment. I was looking for something to do and I saw a commercial in the paper that advertised for a computer animator. They wanted somebody with graphic arts abilities and some kind of portfolio. And I'd called up, and I'd been around computers since 9 years old. My father had been in computing from the very early days when he was building his own computers. And I called up to apply for this job, and the guy said, well, we're looking for somebody out of art school. It's probably not worthwhile. And I was just very curious about what computer animation was and what this sort of burgeoning new field was. And I said, well, can I come in just out of interest and have a look at what you're doing? And he said, okay, fine, bring your school portfolio. And I went in and showed him my portfolio, and he was kind of surprised by it because it was different from what he was seeing out of the art schools where they churned out sort of more similar portfolios. And then on top of that, he was a photographer by background and hadn't had a lot of computer experience. And as he was showing me what he was doing, he was showing me a problem he was having. And just because it came very intuitively to me, I sat down and solved his problem and ended up getting the job. And that was mainly doing TV commercials, station IDs, all that kind of thing. That's where PDI sort of hired me to go to the US and do a similar kind of thing. And initially I thought it would be a whole different type of work there and found out it was a similar type of work with bigger budgets. But then in the early 90s, computer graphics started finding its way into film, initially through visual effects and small parts of films. And that introduced me to the idea of filmmaking, the idea of telling stories, the idea of telling stories more than 30 seconds long, which commercials were all about, of telling stories that didn't necessarily just come on when everyone wanted to go to the bathroom. And generally just got me interested in film. And sort of from then I did a lot of visual effects, working on films like Angels in the Outfield, through the Batman films. The first film I worked on was a Barry Levinson film called Toys. And that led me to the opportunity of directing Shrek. And I sort of ironically went back to animation at a time where I wasn't really expecting to. But Shrek obviously sort of opened some doors with the success of that film. Having grown up in Papua New Guinea and that being really what I called home, because it was the most formative time of life, in those early and late teen years. When I read Mr. Pip, one of the things that really resonated is I knew the characters. I knew a Mr. Watts. I knew Dolores. I knew the characters in the book, so they came to life for me very vividly. I also hadn't been back to Papua New Guinea for about 23 years at the time I read the book, so it made me quite nostalgic. It brought a lot back to me of what I saw as my home, even though the place I grew up has changed so much that the home that I knew didn't really exist. And then, I think that was the hook that got me, and that's certainly why I was given the book to read, because my wife knew that I had grown up there and said, you may like this. And then as I got into it, it resonated on a number of different levels as well. And one was really on this story about the power of story. And having made some big films and sort of now looking for an option to do something different, sort of, it's, I guess, to some degree, a book justifying what I did, about story and about how important it was something that was very tempting. Dickens obviously refers to home a lot in Great Expectations, and it's a lot about, for Pip, it's a lot about the forge being his home. And I think it comes back to that old adage that the home is where the heart is. It's where you feel you belong. And I don't think that's location-based at all. It's sometimes people-based, it's sometimes history-based, sometimes ancestry-based. I think it's different for every individual. But I don't think it's a building. I don't think it's a fixed thing. I think it can move. For me these days, it's where my children are. Anywhere that they are, I immediately feel as home. And that can be when we go on vacation. We'll go somewhere nice and settle in there. I have grown up with this very easy relocation. That's maybe why moving to the US wasn't such a big deal to me. Moving back to New Zealand wasn't such a big deal. When I was shooting in Papua New Guinea, after a week and a half or so, if somebody had said to me, this is where you live for the rest of your life, I would have been kind of, okay. I tend to adapt to a new environment very easily. And I think it's largely just home is where you feel comfortable. The story of Mr. Pip is largely centered around a young girl growing up in a war-torn region. It's set in Bougainville during a real crisis that happened. They call it a crisis, a conflict. Sometimes it's called a civil war, although that's a bit of a misnomer because it was really a war from economic superpowers on a very small island. Centered around this mine, which at the time in the late 70s and 80s was the world's largest open copper mine. But that's kind of the background for the story. The story is really about this young girl left on the island whose father has moved to Australia in search of work. At the time the blockade is put in place by the Papua New Guinea Defence Force, and the lone sort of expatriate white man at the village decides to start teaching the children by reading them Great Expectations. And this very imaginative young girl finds escape in this book. And the character of Pip becomes very real to her, to the point where it becomes real beyond her. And before we know it, the rebels and the army are looking for this character of Pip. And it brings great tragedy to the village. Ultimately, it's really a story about the redemptive power of imagination and the redemptive power of story, but it's also about colonialization through literature. It's about the harm that we can do when we bring our values into a different culture. And what Lloyd did in the book is he ended up writing a very non-judgmental story about that, where this book is the thing that almost destroys her, and it's also the thing that saves her. And I think that's sort of true of a lot of aspects of colonialization. We educate creates opportunities, but it also destroys some aspects of culture that are inherent to who people are and part of people's survival. So I think it's a very complex issue. And what I liked about the book is that Lloyd doesn't actually make a statement about it, he kind of examines it in a very allegorical way. Oh, that's a hard one. Narnia was very important to me growing up. Those were some of the first books I remembered reading and the main reason I made those films. Pinocchio was a story and a movie that always resonated with me. And I've always had that fascination, even still with science fiction, about the idea of what makes us human. How do you define soul? How do you define love? What defines humanity? And I think Pinocchio was my first sort of, inroad to that story, which keeps coming up in science fiction and Star Trek, and we see it over and over again. Trying to think what other stories. I read a lot of Enid Blyton, which not big in the US, but throughout the UK and the Commonwealth. She was a very prolific English writer who wrote children's fables that are all politically incorrect at this point. And now I see my daughters reading, I'm like, really? That was okay back then? Those are the main ones I remember. Well, going into the book, and because in a book you can have the inner monologue, and Lloyd can talk about what Matilda is thinking. In a movie, you don't want to do that unless you're just relying on voiceover so much. You want to find another way of expressing what the character's going through in his or her mind. So in the case of this, I was reading the book and thinking about ways of doing that. My wife, as an artist, had put me onto a number of artists who were playing with issues about colonization. and with costume and with other forms that kind of I found quite inspirational. And I knew that I wanted to create this idea that Matilda was bringing her own experience and her own expectations, so to speak, into this book. Around the same time, I'd also been reading a manuscript for an as yet unpublished book, and I thought the book was set in England, and I was reading it all, and everyone had English accents in my head as I was reading it. And I got partway through and realized it was New England, it was set in Boston, and everyone's accents changed. Subliminally, I didn't realize for another 5 pages that, wait a minute, everybody's voices just changed. And it made me realize how much you bring your expectations into what you're reading. And I thought, well, there's no reason for her, having no idea of a Dickensian world, there's no reason for her to imagine it much differently from her own. And so then that became our language, the dialect in which we were playing. And that informed the costumes, it informed the design of the locations. You know, the first step into Great Expectations for her is in a fairly natural environment in a graveyard. The next step is the beach, but the beach is not like the beaches in Bougainville. It's more of sort of like a coast of the UK kind of beach with big cliffs as opposed to the beautiful white sands. Then the next time is the forge, and now she's dealing with sort of a structure. So basically, and ultimately in this town, but the town is unique and has sandy streets and ducks wandering around and palm trees. So it stays informed, but as she gets deeper and deeper into the book, the Dickensian world infiltrates more into her imagination. And that was just, for me, that was just fun stuff to play with. You know, I like fantasy, I like the imagination. The book is about imagination, so it was a great way of expressing that. Yeah, for me, I've mainly adapted. You know, Shrek was a very loose adaptation based on a sort of 28-page children's book with very few words. So there wasn't a story there so much as an idea. With the Narnia books, they had a huge following, and I felt a responsibility to adapt the books very truthfully. And you know, I said in that case going in, I wanted to make not just a movie of the book, but a movie of my memory of the book as an 8-year-old when I read it, which was actually bigger than the book. My imagination had filled out the story. And one of the things I did in that case is I wrote down everything I remembered about the book before rereading it. When it came to Mr. Pip, it was a much more complex book. It's very, very layered, a lot of complex themes, very poetic. I read it as fairly cinematic, but when I started breaking it down, I found it was a lot more complex than I first realized. And Lloyd had done a lot of very clever prose and sort of trickery to take the audience or the reader off in different directions and bring them back in a way that you can't in a movie which has to have a more sort of, generally has to have a more linear structure. And I also found, of course, on rereading Great Expectations, the density of that book, which he could use on the page in a way that I couldn't really in the film. I had to find a different way of presenting that. So the adaptation for Mr. Pip was very faithful. Like, Lloyd is very happy, and people who know the book are very happy with the treatment of it. But in some ways it's further from the book than the adaptations I did for Narnia. The process for me really, I kind of call it a process of immersion first. I just read and write notes and kind of absorb the book, and then I just start writing. And often I'll go back to the book, but for a long time I'll actually put it down and write more from memory. And then when I'm looking for a particular line of dialogue, I'll go and see where I've scribbled under things and include those. But it was a very, very long process in this case, and one I did in too much of an isolated fashion. You know, retrospectively, I wish I'd included people sooner, because writing is a very lonely process, and you can disappear into this kind of black hole of doubting yourself and questioning what you're doing. And unless you show it to people and get validation or criticism, it's very easy to stay in that black hole for a long time. And that's what I found I did with this book. Yeah, I've really started making progress after I started sharing it. And then people could point to things that I was unsure of and help indicate where I needed to make improvements. The other thing I think that was sort of interesting about the writing process for me for Mr. Pip is I'd never intended to write it. I'd actually sat down to write a treatment to give to other writers to give some indication of where I wanted to take the movie. And as I started writing the treatment, I was kind of going, wow, I've got to keep putting more information in because the book's so dense. And then by the time I sort of had a treatment that was getting to 30 or 40 pages long, I was like, you know, really, I'm actually writing a script here, and just kind of kept going. So I hadn't really ever intended to write it. Knowing about the black hole, I'd kind of intended to avoid it. Mr. Pip was really more the kind of film I intended to direct. Coming out of visual effects, I'd done a couple of Batman films in which I'd made a good chunk of money and saved up enough to live for a year or two on a beach in Portugal. One of my favourite writers is José Saramago, who's a Portuguese writer, and for some reason I had this very romantic idea of going to Lisbon, finding a beach nearby and renting a house, and just, this is after working in film for a while and realising I wanted to tell stories, and just writing, and I had some ideas for sort of small independent films, the kind of film that you can get as your first film. And I really had my mind set on that, and so when Shrek came along and was offered to me as a result of a contact I'd met working in visual effects, I turned it down. I said, no, it's not my plan. And I kept turning it down for about 6 months and referring everybody I knew to it. And they just kept saying, can you give it a try, can you give it a try? And I ended up deciding to try it, and it took 4.5 years. And then that, of course, opened other doors. The Narnia film came about as a result of that, and in the case of Narnia, I ultimately didn't want to turn it down because I was worried that if I didn't do it and somebody else did it and I was disappointed, then I'd only have myself to blame, or at least this way I knew I'd make a film that I would hopefully like. So to some degree, Mr. Pip was a return for me. It was a return to what I had originally intended to do. It was a return to me to my childhood. It was a return to the kind of themes that I like to talk about. So it wasn't so much a departure as everything else was kind of a segue to get back to that point. Well, Mr. Pip in New Zealand, is a very strong existing market for it. The book was a bestseller throughout the Commonwealth. It actually won the Commonwealth Prize. It was shortlisted for a Booker Prize, so there was very strong awareness for it there. The movie opened about a week and a half ago in New Zealand and is playing very, very strongly. It opens in Australia in early November, and we expect it to play very strongly there. The book was not as well known in the US. Bougainville is a long way from the US, even though a large part of the US is on the Pacific. But it's because it's about a small Pacific Island community. I felt that in coming here, when we got the invitation from the Vilcek Foundation and from HIFF to come here, I just felt it would play very well here. I felt it was a really nice festival to bring it to the US for the first time, even as we're searching for distributors, because I just really felt that it would resonate. I mean, you're dealing with small communities, dealing with having to come to terms with colonization, with external commercial superpowers, all of those kind of things. And so I think a lot of the themes resonate very well throughout the Pacific.